been busy, so I've been busy.
All right, everybody.
Yes.
Well, welcome to tonight's lecture here at the museum. My name is Sadie Thayer. I'm the director here, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's lecture, which is the last in our spring series, which will then take a hiatus until the fall and come back with 4 more presentations. So tonight we have a great presenter that we've had come back to us. He presented last time with us in 2012, right after Taylor Bridge and Table Mountain. So I'm sure he'll talk about those among other fires. So John Marshall is a Wenatchee-based photographer and biologist who puts wildfires in perspective through his many years of revisiting burned landscapes and exploration of historic photography. For nearly 25 years, he has used his camera to illustrate what happens after fires. He has been a contract photographer for the U.S. Forest Service and Pacific Northwest Research Station. In his photography career, he has done numerous coffee table books, as well as a stint as a National Geographic photographer on Mount St. Helens. He holds a Master of Science degree in wildlife from the University of Idaho. Please join me in welcoming John Marshall.
Is the microphone picking up?
Yeah.
Thanks for coming tonight, folks. I hope to entertain and enlighten you. We have any firefighters or retired firefighters in the group? Forest Service people, retired Forest Service people? Same person. If those of you that are in the back might want to come a little bit closer for a better view. I think I'm going to move this mic just a little bit closer to me. I think I'll actually put it right here. I'm going to raise it up just a bit. That's perfect. Okay, so as Sadie said in the introduction, I've been looking at wildfires through time, and it used to be that the standard headline after a wildfire was the number of acres destroyed, and I always felt like that was not a fair way of presenting it. That it's really altered. It's set on a different course. The land's still there, and it goes through this amazing journey in time. What was there before the fire may not be, but something different happens, and through fire we get lots of amazing environments, as you'll see. So this first slide is really kind of academic, and it looks like kind of cutting off a little bit. The gist of it is the colors represent different fire return intervals. In other words, how often fire happens on any particular part of the landscape, with the lightest yellow being the most frequent burned areas and the darker colors being the least frequent. But everywhere in the state that wasn't a glacier or rock burned at one time or another. And that's actually needs to burn periodically. So up in the higher elevations, fire doesn't happen very often. This is the Wolverine fire in the upper Entiad. It's an aerial photograph. Up in a place like that, fire might have happened every 100 to 150 years, something like that. But portions of the landscape within a fire sometimes reburn in a shorter period of time. Here's a aerial view from last week taken with a drone. And, you know, to the uninitiated, this looks like horrible destruction. And there's always concerns about watersheds. But in fact, the river gets a couple of things it needs through events like this. One is large woody debris, big logs and that end up anchoring themselves in the stream or on the stream bank and become hiding habitat for fish. The other is rocks that come down and end up being the future spawning gravels. So the fire really is replenishing two very important things for the stream in this picture. So in the drier, lower forests, fire happened far more often than in the colder, wetter forests. Fire return intervals more like 5 to 30 years apart before we disrupted the natural cycles. And fires could be like this, just cleaning up the duff layer. And the lower elevation, Ponderosa pines, predominant tree, it gets a thick bark. It tolerates fire really well. See, 6 years later, it's like very happy. However, I have to say that this stand has been falling apart lately due to bark beetles. These trees are getting to an age where they're being beetle attacked and dying. They survived the fire just fine, but not the bark beetles. When you see trees like this out in the woods, this is where the face of the tree got scarred by the fire, killed off the living tissue. And trees that are old and you saw through them, you can see evidence of fires going way back. I have a wood sample that we can look at afterwards if somebody wants to look at it and explains what happens when a tree gets burned. So here's fire as we really like to see it on the east, lower elevations on the east side of the Cascades. These trees are not harmed by this level of intensity. And coming back 2 years later, you can see that the understory plants and the shrubs are really rebounding also. These plants survived in roots under the soil. Soil is a very good insulator. And in 2002, the brush has really grown back. One thing I want you to notice is this thing right here. Does anybody know what that is? Our Forest Service person probably does. Anybody else? Okay, tell everybody.
Mistletoe.
Yeah, that's a mistletoe broom of Douglas fir dwarf mistletoe, and that is a parasitic plant that causes the tree to grow in very weird, bizarre ways to benefit the mistletoe. And what's interesting is note the height of it in 2011 and see what happens. 6 years later, it's gotten a lot bigger. And it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to realize that fire could really get going in that thing. It's also a good wildlife habitat. So there are critters that really like green forests, and if we don't have mature trees in green forests, these creatures just can't make a living. And so when you have an entire watershed that burns out and everything is killed, it's a disaster for some of these creatures. It's a white-breasted nuthatch. But we've changed the landscape in a way that it's burning in ways that it didn't historically. This is a Frank Matsura photo from 1910 up near Loomis in Okanagan County. And note the rock here. Okay, here's the same place today. This is a result of not having any fires. That historically there was a lot of burning, both lightning strikes and deliberate Indian burning that kept the forest open and patchy. And you remove that process of fire and everything changes. And it becomes more flammable because there isn't space between trees and the dead fuel simply piles up. So one of the things I've been doing is recreating panoramas from the 1930s, and these are panoramas that are at the National Archives in Seattle, and they were part of a Forest Service project in the 1930s to take 3 panoramas, each looking in a different direction at every lookout site in Oregon and Washington. And you can see this one's 1934, and this one's 2017. You can see how much thicker the forest has gotten. It's not the same forest. I did that one with a drone, by the way, because the lookout tower is gone. And the ground you can't see much. But with a drone I could get up above the trees and see everything. And this is a side-by-side taking a slice of it. It is just a very different place. And that's the result of no fires. So you probably saw this photo in the beginning. So these places where the fields, where it hasn't burned in a very long time, when it finally does burn, oftentimes is larger and hotter than it ever has been before. Where I was showing you, telling you that these site forests have these low intensity fires that happen frequently, we're now getting high intensity fires in these places that kill all of the trees. But even so, even though all the trees are dead here, there's incredible resilience in the vegetation, and it goes through an amazing story, which you'll see here. So, first year, what we really had was a lot of sterile wheat because the Forest Service had aerial seeded it. They don't do that practice much anymore. Found it unnecessary. Then we go to 6 years later, we can see we actually have mostly native vegetation. We have arrowleaf balsam root, elk sedge, and blue bunch wheatgrass, and sandburg bluegrass here. You notice also a lot of these snags are falling down. And lots of times this question of salvage logging comes up. You know, why can't you clean up all that stuff? And the fact of the matter is, the only tree that's really merchantable here is this one, and that's the best wildlife tree and the best tree once it falls and forms a log to act as kind of a reservoir for moisture and so on. These trees don't have any value really, or they didn't even, I mean, they have even less value now, but even when they were fresh burned, there wasn't much value there. So we forward to 2006, we're now 12 years after the fire, and you start to see some little Douglas fir trees. It's taken that long for them to really show up.
Where are these photos taken?
Okay, this is up in the Mud Creek area in the Aniak Ranger District. So people for the longest time would see these photos and they say, well, where's the trees? And they just stayed tiny for the longest time. But not now. Because we moved to 2018 and those little tiny trees have gotten big. And now we've got a problem really with too many trees too close together. We kind of got ourselves right back into too many trees. And the Forest Service has since gotten a different philosophy about it, that on the east side we really need gaps between trees and completely open spaces where we don't want to cover the landscape in trees everywhere. We want skips. Because we have skips, then neither fire nor bugs can move through as easily. So these landscapes that were burned became great deer habitat, because when you open it up to sunlight, a lot of the shrubs that deer like to feed on really thrive in that open sunlight without the competition from trees. So the deer do very well. They may suffer the first couple of years after the fire for lack of winter food, but over time it becomes really good deer habitat. And what's good for deer is good for things like golden eagles. I did this one with an infrared tripped camera. I wasn't even there.
What is it eating?
That is a deer, and this was actually a setup. I have to say I cheated. That I tried to get pictures of deer or eagles on roadkill and wasn't having luck, and I realized I needed a blind, and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife allowed me to use some roadkill, which you can't do without a permit. They gave me a permit, so that's how I got this shot. But it's really something that goes on all the time out on the winter range. Deer are always dying out on the winter range, and ravens, eagles, and coyotes find them. So here's another one. This is Potato Creek up the Eniat area. And I like this one. I like this rock because there's no mistaking this place. These are dead ponderosa pines, and at the bottom there's a creek, and all the alders, birches, and cottonwoods down there were top killed, but the roots survived. So 2002, 8 years after the fire, you can see this bottom area is just thriving. These broadleaf trees, cottonwoods, aspens, when you top kill them with fire, they just erupt out of the roots. They just grow like crazy. And it's really good forage for lots of animals. And you notice a couple beaver ponds here. This is 2010. For a while there was just a lot of beavers in that creek. Every little bit had beaver. I didn't see much this year, but beavers tend to come and go. So here we are, a couple weeks ago, 24 years after the fire. And there's one of the beavers. When you have an environment that's mainly broadleaf trees, broadleaf shrubs, that's what beavers like. So this one is up above Leavenworth, up above the fish hatchery and the Sleeping Lady Retreat Center. Maybe somebody can, let's see if any of the kids can answer the question, did the rock crack during the fire or after the fire, and how do we know? Does anybody want to try that? Okay, how about one of you adults? When did it crack? After. And how do you know?
Not charred.
It's not charred, right. So what I think happened was that it got heated, really heated up during the fire. You get 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a forest fire. Really got heated up. And then after the fire passed, it really started cooling. And it was cooling faster on the outside than on the inside. And it set up this tension, and it just split into pieces. But anyhow, 2 years later, what we see is pine grass that's in flower. And pine grass only flowers in response to fire. It needs fire in order to flower. So this is something you don't usually see. And we move forward to 2000. We've got some yarrow. We've got some elk sedge. We've got some elderberry. And then we move to 2010. We've got ponderosa pines going here. And then this is ceanothus, buckbrush. Finally, just last week, 24 years after the fire, we've got some pretty good pines going, and a lot of ceanothus. Here's a picture of the ceanothus. The ceanothus is a really important shrub because it traps nitrogen. Nitrogen's in fertilizer, one of the main components of fertilizer. Air is more nitrogen than anything else, but it takes special bacteria to capture that nitrogen where plants can get it for their roots. And ceanothus does that. It really does a favor for the whole plant community. Same area, a little stream that is just cooked in this draw. It just killed everything. But 3 years later, tremendous growth of fireweed and broadleaf species, whatever broadleaf trees were there before the fire, come up from the roots. But then we have a landslide coming down from up above, and it kind of gouged out the creek bottom. Major disturbance. But it rather quickly healed from that. And we moved to 2018. It's so thick you can't hardly see in front of your face. But that is absolutely the same angle, same camera setup as the first picture. You can imagine how this affects hiding cover for all kinds of creatures that initially they're very exposed, and then gradually they have great hiding cover. This is another one. This is right nearby. This is on a moraine where the glacier dumped rocks at the end of the last ice age. And it was salvage log. And now look at it. It's doing great. And as part of the Forest Service policy, they did leave a lot of snags. They didn't just take everything. The snags are really important for birds, and then they become important when they're on the ground to chipmunks and wood rats, and if they're big, larger animals. So now we're moving to some higher ground. This is taken at the top of Blewett Pass, the Table Mountain fire, when it was really cooking in 2012. Yep, that long ago. And here's an aerial photograph over part of the Table Mountain fire. This is what you would call high severity fire here. This is what you would call mixed severity fire. And typically fires have a range of effects because they kind of pulsate, and they're very affected by slight differences in weather, humidity, wind, what's called atmospheric stability. Things we can't even see affect fire behavior like crazy. So it doesn't come out all the same. And there's some Initially, some pretty bad impacts on soils. The soils can be hydrophobic. Water can run right off of them. But there's also some really good soil effects. There's a nutrient release when you burn plant matter. If it doesn't burn super hot, it actually leaves the soil with nutrients that were in those plants, and that's why you get this flush of morel mushrooms. And you get some pretty cool wildlife habitats. What happens is these trees have dead heartwood, and the fire gets in it, and it hollows them out. And some of these trees can be hollow way up high in the tree, so it's not hard to imagine. Those are great denning trees for all kinds of creatures, and they'll stay up for quite a few years and then eventually fall down. But fire really delivers a habitat to a lot of creatures. And you get this amazing response. The top picture actually should say 2013. It was the beginning of 2013, and then 3 years later, here's the same site. Now this is a moist environment along a creek. And there's more fireweed there than anything, but there's also a lot of willow. And this was interesting. This was a stand of subalpine fir, little spindly subalpine fir trees, and they basically got steamed and bent. You can imagine the wind that did that. And fires, they do make their own wind. Because as the column's going up, the air is sucked into the side. And so the combination of being heated up and having wind forced on it took these trees that were normally very, very straight and bent them over. And I came back 3 years later, and this is what I got. Now this is a site that really got cooked, and I really thought, oh my gosh, the soil's been sterilized here. This site isn't going to grow much for a long time, but why don't I take a picture and see what happens? And I've been surprised. I came back in 2 years, and I see quite a bit. And I come back in 3 years, and the plants are doing much better there than I would have thought, given how hot that was. And the trees there are all lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine thrives in a post-fire environment. So, kind of introducing you to an idea here, I want to say that the pattern a fire burns in is really important, because you think about it from a creature's point of view. This offers something, so does this. And when you're along the line here, you have the best of all worlds. If you think about it this way, a place like this is going to be cooler, and in the wintertime, these trees are going to be out of the snow, where a creature like a moose can chew on them. But the amount of seedy type things that produce seeds, there's not a whole lot there. Whereas in the burn, right next door to it, you've got a lot of grass, you've got a lot of plants producing seeds, and in a few years you get a lot of plants producing berries. So you get different things from different environments. So, shifting gears again, we're going to talk about these Osborne Panoramas. I told you there were 3,000 of these panoramas. They're about this big. There's prints at the National Archives. The camera that took him was one of these. This particular one is in the Fire Museum in Spokane. There's a Fire Lookout Museum in Spokane. And they only made, according to one account, they made 6. According to another account, they made 8. That's all. 8 cameras, period. They were custom made for the U.S. Forest Service by Leupold and Volpol in Portland. It was a Forest Service employee, William Osborne, that designed these. They weighed 75 pounds, and the rule was that if it was 4 miles or less, you were required to pack it. If it was more than 4 miles, you got a horse or a mule. Those guys were tough in those days, but they were all like 20 years old too. So what it did is, inside the camera is a circular, sort of a half circle that the film laid against, and the lens actually rotates during the exposure. There's a clock motor where they wind it up and they let it go, and it actually, the lens swings through the exposure. It's really ingenious. So I've been probably to 40, maybe 50 sites, lookout sites, and done well over 100 of these panoramas. This was one of the more interesting ones that I did. This was up in Okanagan County. And I had trouble finding it because it wasn't on a mountaintop. Most of the lookout towers are right at the ridge top of the mountaintop. They're easy to find. This one was 2/3 the way up the slope. And I had a heck of a time finding it. I've spent about 8 hours walking that hillside, and I stumbled into a bunch of boards, and then I knew I was there. But what really floored me was there's a distinctive tree in the photo from, I think, 1938. That same distinctive tree is there now. Now look at here. Under this tree, what you see is a stack of stove wood. Firewood cut to the length to fit in a very small wood-burning stove. Okay? What did I find on the ground? Under that same tree? Stove wood. It's still there, which tells you something about the rate of decay of wood on our side of the mountains. And it says something about what happens to dead wood between fires. It sticks around. The wood pile just gets bigger. It's one of the reasons why the longer we wait between fires, the worse it's going to be. So here's another one. I was telling you about how fire creates different environments. So what you had going on before we interrupted natural fire cycles was a lot of small fires that were coming at different times, and each fire created a new environment. And then you also have the older, mature forest in the mix of it. So you had all of these environments. And now with 80 years of no fire, it all nips over to trees, which creates 2 problems. Bugs can run through it because there's no place where the trees stop. And fire can run through it because there aren't openings where the fire might go out. And so you tend to get bug epidemics and fires that are much larger. This is one up in the North Cascades, Slate Peak, up near Mazama. And look at how variable it was in the 1930s and how that's just knitted together now in the absence of fires. This one is closer to here. This is Bald Mountain. You can get to it by going up the Monastash and up a Horrible Road, or come around through the Natchez Riverside. But look at how the meadows have shrunk. Fire creates and maintains meadows, and you lose your meadows over time. And for some creatures like mountain goats, that's pretty important. There are mountain goats in that area, and I'd say they've had a significant degradation of their habitat. And here's another example of this, also in this area. This is Thorpe Mountain. You go up through Roslyn and on up another 10 miles up the river, and it's a hike. Look how much of the area was burned, how much of these ridgeline areas were recently burned in the 1930s and would have been open meadowy area that would be great summer foraging for mountain goats. And I don't know if you know this, but the mountain goats were overhunted in the 1970s. The Wildlife Department freely admits it. But even though hunting is very restricted now, the mountain goats have never rebounded from what happened in the 1970s. And I speculate that a lack of fire is one of the problems, that they don't have the quality summer range that they did have. Again, up Thorpe Mountain, look at all that open area and look at what it is today. Now granted, you got logging, but that's down here, not up on the ridge lines. Picture that I took a few days ago with a drone at Mount Hood. A lot of fire in here and evidence of fire in there. What we see today, we don't see much evidence of fire. We do see clear cutting. Clear cutting really isn't the same because fire leaves, snags, and logs behind. Clear cutting doesn't leave much of that. But a lot of the same plants will grow in a clear cut as in a burn. Plants that like open sunlight. This is also at Mount Hood. This is near Government Camp, the popular recreation area. Very much burned in the 1930s. All knitted over in forest today. And I fear that someday we're going to get a fire that's just going to scream through here. And since we're around Mount Hood, let's talk a bit about the Eagle Creek fire in the Columbia Gorge. A lot of people were upset for good reason. The scenery that they love changed. From an ecological point of view, it's actually a good thing. The fire didn't just take out everything, it burned in patches, and there's a lot of new environments that are going to come out of that. And these historic photos give us perspective because this photo is taken up Tanner Creek drainage in the Columbia Gorge in the 1930s, and you see it was largely a burned area, and people have forgotten that. So I've also been up on Mount Rainier doing this. This is up at almost a camp near at 9,500 feet. And you can see we've lost the tail of this glacier. This top photo is 1930s. We've lost that glacier. We've lost this glacier. This really shows a big loss in glacier. But there's also another story besides the glaciers up there. This is a 1934 photo showing the mound of shrub and open meadow. And today, not nearly as much. So whether you're a marmot or a mountain goat or a person that likes wildflowers, there's less of it. So kind of thinking about as humans and how we're living different than the people that were here 150 years ago. The Native Americans deliberately lit fires, both to drive game for hunting and to make better habitat where they would have more animals to hunt. And they also burned to just keep the country open so they could get through it. I talked with a fellow whose great-grandfather came to the Methow in the late 1800s and talked about how the Indians every fall would just light fires all the way down the Methow Valley. And that's consistent with other accounts. So we go from people that couldn't put fires out and actually lit them deliberately to people that were able to put out fire. So the Indians, besides the hunting and the berry gathering, willow shoots, as they are after fire, are really important for basket weaving. And you can say, well, how important is basket weaving? Well, how did they tote things around? Basket weaving was very important. And the elongated shoots you get after fire was very important to their material culture. So here we are, we're trying to live in this environment that's always burned, and we're plunking ourselves down the middle of it. It's a concerning situation. I was out on some fires last summer up at the Jolly Mountain Fire, and the fire crews were doing a great job of saving these houses, but it took a tremendous amount of due diligence. I mean, they had had to lay all these hose lays and get all this pumps going, and have pools full of water. They had helicopters overhead. They had crews just watching things. In this case, they're actually lighting the woods on fire at night when they get the least violent fire behavior so they could avoid a fire during the day. But it took tremendous due diligence and at tremendous expense. It can cost as much to save a house as it would be just to write a check to rebuild it. So some other alternatives, some ways we could make our forests more safe is to do some thinning and prescribed burning. This is up in Okanagan County on state wildlife land. This is before anything was done, but remembering that it's not the forest that was here, it's much more dense. And then they did prescribed actually logging, but leaving the big trees, and prescribed fire, and here's prescribed burning. And then they had a wildfire, and everything went just really well. So we can create more resilient environments. So the other thing we can do is not automatically put out every fire immediately. That it makes sense to kind of size up the situation. There are circumstances where we absolutely want to snuff the fires out, but there are situations where the fire actually could be beneficial. And what we do is what's called managed wildfire, which means establishing parameters within which we allow the fire to burn. So in other words, once it gets to this spot of the map, we'll suppress it. But before that, we really like what it's going to do, we're just going to let it do its thing. Or if we have a weather outlook that looks like it's going to be hot and windy, we suppress it. but if it looks like it's going to be cool and damp, we're just going to let it do its thing. And I think that's really important, otherwise we're just digging ourselves a deeper hole. So we'll always need firefighters, but we need to have a flexible response. So, fire has always been part of the natural scene. It's as much as something that shapes the landscape as geology and climate. Is as much something that creates as it does destroy. It's highly variable, and it's always going to be with us. So with that, I will open up questions. If we can have the lights on and surely there's some questions. Yes.
What about sagebrush areas? Have you taken any photos of that?
Sagebrush areas?
Yeah.
I have now. The most common sagebrush we have is called big sagebrush, and it does not come back from the roots. It has to seep back in, and sagebrush is actually it's actually got a real problem because we have this thing called cheatgrass that thrives on fire, and it grows really thick between the sagebrush bushes and carries the fire rapidly. And the cheatgrass is an annual plant that drops its seed, and when fire happens, the plant itself is dead. It's just waiting for next year's seed, whereas the sagebrush is a perennial plant, and the sagebrush gets heavily damaged with repeated fires carried by cheatgrass. And so we're actually losing a lot of our sagebrush environments. It's a real concern. Yeah. Yes.
I was curious if the 1930 photos were pristine, if you will, recognizing there's Native American fires, or if some of those photos capture changes from logging and other civilization things. How are you able to, I guess, assess as to how much of the natural range of variability they capture?
Well, what I see oftentimes in 1930s photos is salvage logging. That where it was national forest, they really weren't going after the wood in the national forests until about the 1960s.
Okay.
That what happened was the private timberlands got logged first, and the Forest Service wasn't going to want to compete with the private timberlands, and so most of the logging in the 1930s was going on private timberlands. But that being said, there was this philosophy that a dead tree left in the woods is waste. So they did quite a lot of salvage logging. But then there's other places where the lookout photos look out on some of the bigger valleys, like say the Stillaguamish River, and you see that the entire river drainage doesn't have hardly a fir tree in it. And that was from railroad logging in the 1890s. So, how pristine are those photos in the 30s? I would say for the most part, they haven't really been affected by logging. And fire suppression was just starting to become effective. I mean, the Forest Service started in 1905, but they really weren't effective at firefighting until they got the CCC in the 1930s. So the fire cycles hadn't been altered that much, unless you take into account the fact that the Native Americans had been moved off the land, and you didn't have this Native Americans lighting fire. And that went away, in the 1870s? People being put on reservations. So they're not exactly as things were before we got here, but a lot closer to it than today. Yeah.
From what I understand, the fires now, on average, say the 2000s, are up to 10 times bigger and hotter than they were, say, in the 50s, 60s, 30s, as you portrayed. You may have alluded to this, but the effect is that with all the crown fires and so forth and large swaths areas, the forests don't have the regenerative capacity that we saw in some of what you showed. That their ability to reproduce and get seeds and so forth is greatly diminished.
Well, it depends on what's left in the way of green trees. Seeds are only carried so far. You know, you've got this tree and it's got cones, and within 100 feet there's a whole lot of seeds falling. Within 200 feet there's less. Within 2,000 feet even less yet. So there is a problem when there isn't anything green, unless it happens to be lodgepole pine. And lodgepole pine is doing really well in this fires that are happening, because lodgepole pine has these cones. They have cones that open every year, and then they have cones that are sealed. They're called serotinous cones. They have kind of a resin, and the cone will just sit there for years and years, and it takes heat to open it up. And so you have a fire, and you've got all these stored up cones, they suddenly open up, and you'll have something where, yeah, there isn't a green tree left, but the next year you go out there, it looks like a lawn with lodgepole pine seedlings. But what isn't making it there is all these other species, and you get just lodgepole, which is not a real interesting forest.
And this is a worldwide problem, not just northwestern U.S.
Well, I wouldn't call it worldwide, but it's a problem throughout the western United States. And so, like, when I went up on Table Mountain, I wasn't seeing any tree seedlings except lodgepole pine. And that, you know, that's not bringing back the kind of forest I'd like to see.
Are you familiar with this book, John, and would you recommend it to people? I'm finding it. It's a 2017 publication.
I have not read it. I haven't heard anything bad about it, so
It's great.
Yeah, oh, good.
Everything you talked about in more depth and complexity, and just short chapter is very interesting.
I should read it. Michael Kodas. Is that how you pronounce it?
Kodas, yeah. I'll just pass it around if people want to take a look at it, because it's excellent. And why is it the Forest Service that's continuing to advertise Smokey the Bear? Or who is? I heard it on NPR today, and I was surprised.
And Forest Service, they seem like they're reluctant to let go of Smokey the Bear.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm not a fan of Smokey. You know, they kind of wrap their identity around Smokey the Bear, really.
Right. Give it up.
Yeah. They need a new mascot.
Right.
They sure do. I mean, he wasn't telling it right.
Got us in a lot of trouble.
Actually, fires are great for bears on the
Right.
whole. Yeah. Well, it's an odd place to be in that we honestly don't want people willy-nilly starting fires. A fire at the wrong time is a terrible thing. So we want people to be careful with fire. But it's confusing when, under the right circumstances, a fire could be the best thing that happened. So it's a complex thing to talk about. More questions? Yes.
How heavy is your camera?
Not heavy at all. Well, I mean, I'm using a DSLR, a Canon, so it's probably, the camera's probably 2.5 pounds, and the tripod with the head and everything's probably 10 pounds.
What about your drone?
Well, my favorite drone weighs, it weighs about 11 pounds, but if it's, it has a special backpack and extra batteries and that, so it's probably like packing 20 pounds. Yeah, so nothing like what those guys had to deal with. Yeah, the Osbornes are amazing. They're not all great photos though, because they were on a schedule. And they got to a lookout and they took the photos whether it was good light and good weather or not. And the other thing that's sort of a frustration is they were not real photographers. And you see some pictures where they put people in them, but they posed them in very clumsy ways. You just kind of go, oh gosh, if you'd only had that guy move 10 feet over there, it could have been so good. You know? Yes.
You mentioned seeing Others, and I know, areas where they have like standard placing fire and the seeing Others comes back really thick. Does that actually play a helpful role in the timber species coming back?
Well, yes and no. It's hard for, it can be hard for trees to get a toehold on ceanothus because it's so thick it just doesn't allow any room. On the other hand, it's really putting nitrogen in the ground. And I know the Forest Service actually used to spray ceanothus to get rid of it, and I assume the timber companies still do today, that they felt like the competition of it outweighed the factors of it that it enriches the soil. But I don't know if that's how good that strategy is. But it definitely does compete with trees, yet it also provides nitrogen for trees.
Right. So in the long view, the forest will probably just look a little different.
What's that?
In the long run, the forest will just look a little different.
Yeah, it will. Now what I'm seeing is the ponderosa pines are pushing up through the ceanothus and they're eventually going to shade it out. But if you're in a timber company and you're in a hurry to get things going again with a new crop of trees, maybe you don't want to wait, but they also actually use fertilizer, commercial fertilizer. So, it's not really, it's a different strategy. Yes?
Have you done this with, like, all over the Forest Service region? Or, I mean, how your photo collection is really pretty dramatic. I was curious, how extensive is it? Have you gone to all of the lookouts in Washington and tried to recreate pieces of it?
Yeah, it's been pretty piecemeal, and it has a lot to do with Forest Service funding. I'm going to be doing some down in the Columbia Gorge this summer, and it looks like the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest is going to have me do a bunch. And the Umatilla would like me to be doing some, but doesn't have any money for me this year, so a lot of it has to do with budget. So it's been kind of helter-skelter. I honestly would like to systematically be doing these Osborne Panoramas with the idea of doing a public exhibit someday. But I think maybe I need private funding to do that. Other questions? Well, I've enjoyed the audience. Thanks for coming. I hope I gave you some new ideas, some new ways of looking at things. Feel free to come up and talk to me up here or look at the fire scars on the slice of Douglas fir tree over there. So, yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.